So as Kim had mentioned, I work at Jewish Family and Children's Service in Greater Boston, and I lead a network called the Percolator, which is a resource for people who are starting and sustaining memory cafes across the United States. We started just in Boston, then we expanded to all of Massachusetts. Now we have participation from across the country and a handful of other countries as well. And the web page for the Percolator is down below here, jfcsboston.org/percolator. So a lot of the resources that I'm going to be mentioning are accumulated there on that page. You can also join our mailing list there, and my contact information is there as well. And you're welcome to follow up with me about anything that I mentioned today that you'd like to explore further. And I do also run the Dementia Friends Public Awareness Program for Massachusetts. So here's what we're going to focus on. We're going to talk briefly, just a snapshot of what a memory cafe is and how it dovetails with other social engagement programs. And then I'll talk about transitioning to a virtual format or starting a virtual cafe from scratch, and what are sort of some of the key ingredients to consider in doing that. And at the end, I have a few slides which detail resources that you can go to learn more. So I do recognize I'm going to be covering a lot fairly quickly, but everything I'm talking about is accumulated in places where you can go back and really read through it on your own. So one caveat is that we are still very much in a time of transition in the memory cafe world, and really with respect to everything that all of us do. So most of the photos in this presentation are going to show in-person memory cafes, because that's mostly the photos that we have. I love showing photos of programs in process, so you're going to see a lot of pictures like this one of people sitting next to each other in a way that unfortunately we're not doing right now. So what is a memory cafe? Just going to give you a little snapshot here. The key ingredients are that it is a welcoming environment, that it's really friendly and relaxed, and the focus is on social connection. So these are not places to go and have lectures or to learn about dementia necessarily, although every cafe is different and some do offer educational programs, but really the core goal is social connection. And they are designed for care partners as well as people living with dementia. They are generally, most of them, for people at any stage of disease progression with any underlying condition that causes dementia. Now, there are some cafes that are geared toward people in an early stage of disease progression. In Massachusetts, where I am, all cafes are for people at any stage. And I'm going to talk about that trade-off and decision a little bit later in the presentation. One key piece is that guests are not asked if they have a diagnosis or what that diagnosis is. So the cafes are really an open door for people who haven't been diagnosed or who are very uncomfortable acknowledging that diagnosis. And finally, they're tailored to local interests, languages, and needs. And because of that, every cafe looks different. Every cafe should look different. It should take on the flavor of what people are interested in that local community. So why do these cafes exist? And sometimes they're called Alzheimer's, sometimes they're called memory cafes. This is a quote from, I would say, more than one of the guests who have come to my memory cafe. All of our friends disappeared. So unfortunately, a lot of times people don't know how to stay connected with someone who is exhibiting symptoms of dementia, and friends just fade away. And that is really the primary purpose, is to connect people. And the need is greater than ever right now. We all know that COVID has brought with it reduced access to activities and social support, and a greater feeling of isolation. This is not only for the person with the diagnosis, but also the people who are close to them. So cafes and other forms of connection are really vital. As I mentioned, I'm hoping this presentation will be informative for you, even if you're not involved with memory cafes per se, because there are a lot of common threads. I think that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about fits with any social or creative engagement program for people living with dementia and care partners, or really any strength-based activities that aspire to help people live well with dementia. So before I dive into the details, I want to just reflect with you for a moment about this virtual world and what it means for us. And the framing that I want to give you is that loss and growth can happen at one and the same time. So we all know we're in a time of a lot of loss. Stressed organizations are being faced with how to reinvent their programs. A lot of times they've had to lay people off, so they're trying to do this with fewer hands on deck. Some staff and some participants don't have the hardware or reliable internet or the comfort with technology necessary to really dip a toe into this virtual world. And even though those who do, technology brings with it a lot of annoyances and challenges that are just different from the kind that we're used to. And some, not all, people with advanced dementia find virtual programs confusing or disengaging. So there are people for whom this format will not work. COVID-19 has also definitely taken a toll on equity. We are already in a situation with rampant disparities, as we know, based on race, based on ethnicity, socioeconomic factors, and now there's a disproportionate disease burden in some communities, and the digital divide was always there, but it's even more critical now because people are relying on technology to see their doctor or meet other basic needs, have their kids in school, etc. So those are the losses, we're all aware of them. And what I am finding in the memory cafe world is that growth and opportunities really coexist and sit side by side with those losses. Virtual programs are more accessible for some participants. There's no need to get up and out of the house. There's no travel, no parking. People can attend from any location. So there are not very many memory cafes, certainly in the US, for people who speak a language other than English. But now that cafes are happening virtually, distance is not a barrier. So for example, the SA Amigos Cafe in San Antonio is bilingual, Spanish and English. And I know people in the Boston area who attend. Likewise, I know Brazilian immigrants in our area who are attending Memory Cafe Brazil, which is in Sao Paulo in Portuguese. So this is a wonderful gain. Another example of how distance has disappeared is that I often will have multiple family members attending my memory cafe from different parts of the country. I think I was just muted there. Can you hear me again? Okay, great, thank you. So multiple family members can attend from different locations in this virtual world. And finally, the cafes are now less expensive to run. We're not dealing with food. We don't need supplies so much. So there are some growth, some opportunities as well. Finally, I just want to say, don't underestimate the power of virtual connection. And to illustrate that, I want to point you toward this organization, Dementia Mentors, that has been running virtual memory cafes for over 7 years on Zoom. These cafes are international and they're attended exclusively by people living with dementia, not care partners, just people living with dementia. And I had the privilege of sitting in on one a couple years ago, and the sense of connectedness among this group was very clear. You can go to their website and watch a little recorded demo of one of their virtual memory cafes. So it is certainly possible to have meaningful connections virtually. So what will the future hold? You know, I think there are so many positives to doing these programs virtually that what I hope is that when someday we're able to meet in person again, we can find ways to preserve those benefits and have sort of a hybrid situation. So with that, I'm going to dive into virtual memory cafes and really get into more of the nitty-gritty with you. I thought I would start by just giving you a snapshot of what's happened in Massachusetts since COVID-19 began. Massachusetts, together with Wisconsin, are the two states that have the largest density of memory cafes. Massachusetts had over 120 cafes And since COVID, 12 have closed. They just couldn't sustain it. They couldn't allocate staff time to finding a new way to run it. Several others are on hiatus. They're really not sure yet if they're going to be able to sustain their program. 25, and that number is growing daily, are now meeting virtually. And then a handful, about 3 to 5, are meeting outside. And I'm not going to delve into that, but if you're interested in more information about what it looks like to hold outdoor meetings, our quarterly percolator meeting in September earlier this month focused on that, and the recording and the slides for that are on the percolator website. So one question that comes up, is it possible to start from scratch as a virtual cafe? And the answer is yes, it is happening. Mostly what I'm seeing is that cafes starting from scratch on a virtual basis already had funding and some of the planning in place before the pandemic. So the train had left the station, so to speak, and they decided they could change their plans and open up as a virtual program. The reality is many of the considerations are going to be the same, whether you're starting virtually or in person. So you really can make use of toolkits that have been developed for in-person cafes. At the resource slides at the end, I'm going to show you where you can find those toolkits. There are a few differences for those who are starting a cafe from scratch on a virtual basis. One is that you need to consider digital accessibility, both for staff and for cafe guests. It's really important that the staff who are running the program be comfortable enough with the platform and how to manage an event on that platform. And then the cafe guests may need some support. They may need to receive how-to videos. They may need to receive some one-on-one outreach to learn how to connect with that meeting. You also have to decide, will we transition to a physical space when we're able to? Is that something we need to build into the planning now, to have a space planned and to let our guests know what the plan is? Because if someone is connecting from across the other side of your state, they're not going to be able to continue if you then shift to a physical location that's too far for them. And then finally, you need to decide, how locally focused do we want to be? Do we want to have this virtual program just for people in our locality? Do we want to make it available for anyone, anywhere in the world, or something in between? So how to meet virtually? Most cafes are meeting on Zoom. I have heard of cafes meeting on GoToMeeting, Facebook Live, BlueJeans, WebEx. My suggestion would be use whatever platform is familiar to you, and if your organization supports one, use that one. But if you're starting from scratch, Zoom is what has become most familiar to the general public. So I would suggest that. You can also consider offering a phone option. So Zoom, for example, as well as other platforms, gives you a call-in number. In my memory cafe, I always have 1 or 2 people who don't use a computer but are just calling in and participating that way. And so I try to think about which activities are going to work better for people who just are on the phone. A couple times I went ahead and mailed printouts of the slides to those folks in advance. That's something that requires planning, and there is a cost involved. And then if you have people on the phone, you just have to kind of narrate the action a little bit so that they feel connected. It's also possible to do programming exclusively by phone. And I just want to mention Gary Glazner, who's the founder and executive director of the Alzheimer's Poetry Project. And he's developed something called a poetry party, which is a 30-minute program styled like an old-fashioned radio show that happens exclusively by telephone. And you can contact Gary if you're interested in more information. So when to hold your cafe? This is one of those basic considerations that everybody needs to think about, whether their cafe is in person or virtual. And what I find is, for some people, morning is best and afternoon is terrible. For others, it's the reverse. So you just have to pick a time that's sustainable for you. And then if you're trying to reach a particular group of people, maybe people with younger onset dementia who may be employed or their care partners may be employed, an early evening could be a good bet. You also want to consider when other cafes are making their programs available so that yours can complement theirs rather than conflicting. That was something we learned early on in Massachusetts, is that some of our guests would go to multiple cafes throughout the month as long as they didn't meet at the same time. I have seen that many cafes are providing shorter, more frequent online cafes, for example, meeting twice a month for 1 hour each time, rather than once a month for 2 hours. But it can work either way. I continue to run my cafe once a month for 2 hours, which is what I had always done. So let's talk about where you find the people to come to your cafe. I think that outreach and attendance is, for most cafes, the biggest challenge. Not for all of them. I've seen some cafes that get really high attendance, and that's a stable phenomenon. But for most cafes, there's a challenge there. And I also want to talk about not only the numbers of people who are attending, but who is attending and how to think about making sure your cafe is inclusive. So there are 4 challenges to publicizing your cafe. 1, people don't talk openly about dementia. So it's just a hard conversation to start from the get-go. 2, most people are not familiar with memory cafes. If you say, I'm starting a support group, people kind of get an image in their minds of what a support group looks like. If you say memory cafe, chances are they draw a blank. They just don't know. And then many of the people who you want to reach have already become isolated, so it's harder to find them through other types of programs because they may not be attending. And then a new barrier, number 4, is that technology can be a barrier to virtual participation for some of your potential participants. This slide I know is overwhelming, full of text, and these slides will be available to you, but I just want to touch on a few things. Publicizing a virtual cafe is mostly the same as publicizing an in-person cafe. You want to connect with providers. You can reach out through your local paper or cable TV, social media, connect with other organizations. Think about, in particular, support groups and other places where, day programs where you might find people who would be interested. I do want to mention this last bullet point in black here. Encourage people to attend with friends. So oftentimes friends want to stay connected, but they don't know how. They don't know how to enjoy time with their friend who has now developed dementia. They feel intensely uncomfortable. So attending a memory cafe together is a great way for that friend to enjoy time, stay connected, and also help out the primary care partner by giving that person a break. And this works just as well virtually as it does in person. We have a blog post, we did a blog at JF&CS about a pair of friends who attend the JF&CS Memory Cafe together, and we're really trying to suggest that people think about that. So the main change since COVID is simply that, posting flyers on bulletin boards or at resource fairs isn't really a thing anymore. But otherwise, it's kind of the same steps, the same challenge. One idea that I've seen is quite successful is a kickoff event. So again, I mentioned most people have not heard of a memory cafe. So when you do your outreach, if you say to people, hey, come check out the memory cafe, well, most of them aren't going to know what that is. So if you hold an event that reaches a bit broader audience, for example, a Dementia Friends information session, and I know Washington is one of the states that has an active Dementia Friends program. So that's an educational session about dementia. And then you tag onto that session an introduction to your memory cafe. Then you've brought in a larger group of people, and you can ask those people to be your ambassadors for the cafe. You can say to them, this is what a memory cafe is all about. This is how it works. This is what happens during the 1 or the 2 hours that we meet, and let them know. A lot of people are isolated. A lot of people haven't heard of cafes. And so could you please think of people in your life who might be interested and let them know. So I've seen this really help cafes start with very strong attendance. Do expect it to take time. So we've done 2 surveys of the Percolator Network over the years. The most recent one was last spring. And both times, what we learned is that word of mouth is the #1 way that people find memory cafes. And that just simply takes time. It means that, sorry, let me push that button, that people need to come to your cafe, see what it's like, and then share that with others. So I always say, you know, give it 6 months, really. Let's talk a little bit about inclusion. Cafes really strive to be inclusive, free of charge, generally speaking. We right now are really working to be digitally accessible, and in the prior situation, it was very important to hold a cafe in a physically accessible location, free of stigma, and then responsive to the cultures and needs of the people whom you serve. So I always say, ask the Mr. Rogers question. Who are the people in your neighborhood, and are they coming to your cafe? Now, what does neighborhood mean nowadays? You can decide. I mentioned this before. Some cafes still focus on serving their town or locality through virtual platforms. I have seen cafes in a region join up together and they rotate virtual cafe gatherings. There's a region called Metro West near Boston where there's about 8 different cafes that are doing this, and they take turns throughout the month. And then some cafes are advertising nationally or internationally. So here are some steps that memory cafes that have been active in the Percolator Network have taken to promote inclusivity. And these are from a survey we did about a year ago. So to reach out to all communities within the area and really actively cultivate connections with other providers, including faith communities, group homes for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, because a subset of that group, people with Down syndrome, are highly likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. But for that group as a whole, they develop dementia at the same rate as the general public. Residences for older adults, those are just some examples. Offer a range of music or food if we're in person. Represent many communities on the flyer, so really think about the images that you're showing. Give guests from many cultural and linguistic backgrounds opportunities to tell their story. Include the experience of professional caregivers. Here in Massachusetts, 40% of direct care providers are immigrants. A lot of times at our cafe, we may have direct care providers who are from many different countries in the room. And I really see the cafe as a place for them as well to be able to relax, to enjoy, and to share that richness of their own experience. Some cafes are able to have multilingual staff who are able to translate when needed. But I think the most important thing is to be intentional about it. This isn't something where we can just say, well, I'm building it and they'll come. No, we have to really try to be conscious about the barriers that may exist and work to bridge, build bridges. I had mentioned earlier, there's the question of whether a cafe is going to serve people at all stages of disease progression. So this is another parameter of inclusivity. And I just want to mention some of the benefits to doing that. If you designate your cafe as for people at an early stage only, then you have to have some kind of screening process. You have to have some kind of process for having people move on when they've passed that early stage. And conversely, if your cafe is open to people at any stage, you don't have to do those things. You'll be able to serve people longer, and that can help build a sense of community. And that's really important because often people don't find their ways to cafes that early in the process, and disease progression can be rapid. And finally, if you're open to people at any stage, then as your guests perhaps move to a long-term care residence or start attending a day program some of the week, they can still come. I find that a lot of times providers are concerned about the idea of having people at different stages in the room together. And they're also concerned about whether they can manage any kind of issues that might come up for people with more advanced dementia. And we have done surveys on this in the Percolator as well. And Dr. Jutta Luckvig, who's one of the people who brought cafes to the United States. She has done surveys on this, and we just find these are not issues. So really quickly, role of the cafe coordinator and volunteers. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but monthly cafes usually require about 20 hours per month, so 5 hours per week. If you're doing a cafe more frequently, obviously it requires a little bit more time, but there needs to be some point person to just coordinate things and run the show. Volunteers are wonderful, and you can continue having volunteers virtually as well as in person. I have a partnership with Brandeis University, and the students bring in a different generation. They are very helpful, and they also gain a different picture of what it means to live with dementia than they might if they were volunteering, say, at a nursing home. It's really a strength-based environment where they're getting to see people with dementia expressing themselves and happy. You may also want to consider having a couple of technology volunteers. This can be a great role for younger people. We sometimes use the term digital natives. I have 2 teenagers, and they just grew up with such a comfort level with computers and the online world that I will never achieve. I just know it. So this can be a nice role for students, younger people. And it really pays off right now because, again, technology is not just the way to access many of the memory cafes, but also basic needs like your doctor's appointment. So this can work quite well. So I want to talk a little bit about activities that can work well at memory cafes. I'll give you a few principles. Focus on the process, not the product. So if you are singing together, the goal is not to be on key, but it's for people to feel that sense of synergy and connection and all the magic that music creates for people. Hold space for people living with dementia to be able to participate. So care partners tend to jump in. So when I'm facilitating something, I always like to pause several times and ask for someone who hasn't participated yet. And I'm speaking very quickly to you today, but I really try to pace it and be aware when care partners are just quicker to respond and find ways, perhaps by engaging with people by name, to draw out the people with dementia who may just need more processing time. I like this idea of dignified playfulness. So I came up with this term because I noticed that when people attend memory cafes, their antennae are really out for anything that makes them feel they're being infantilized. This is particularly challenging with visual art activities. That's my background, actually. I'm an art school dropout from way back, so I love doing visual art at the cafes, and I wish this weren't the case, but I've had to be particularly careful when we're collaging or something like that. And we always start by anchoring it in an adult tradition. Like we'll talk about Matisse and how he invented the collage, and then we'll do our own. So adults need to play just as much as children, but we don't always think that we do. So we have to help people reinforce the dignity and the adult context. And then once people relax, then they can roll their sleeves up and play. Keep the plans simple and flexible so that you can improvise based on what people are responding to. And one size does not fit all. Cafes really differ depending on who attends and what they're into. Some cafes don't have programming at all. They're just a time for people to chat and hang out. So really you want to get feedback from your guests about what they like and don't. For virtual cafes, one difference is that the facilitator needs to show more enthusiasm and energy, probably, bigger gestures, because we're literally reaching out there through this flat screen and trying to keep people engaged. Engaging people by name can help. But sort of on the flip side, one thing I've noticed, we have started having a discussion for the last half hour of our cafe, and this works so much better on Zoom than it ever did when we were in the cafe room, because we're all there at sort of the face level, facing each other. Whereas in our room, we would have this big semicircle. Some people would be far enough apart that maybe they couldn't hear as well. So again, there are these hidden gifts of this virtual format that can work especially well with some types of activities. So categories of online activities that I've seen being used: conversation, so discussion of themes. Timeslips.org is a great resource. They have this repository called Beautiful Questions, which are wonderful discussion topics. Games, physical activity, mindfulness, relaxation, slide presentation and discussion, singing, drumming. So for drumming, you can have them get a jar of peppercorns or other spices. Singing, and I'm going to talk about the logistics of that in a minute. Open mic poetry. One really fun thing is that when you're at home and everybody's at home, you can show each other things in your house. So I'm just going to grab, this is this kind of reindeer rabbit thing that my daughter made at an art camp several years ago. So I like to show this as the thing that makes me smile. And we've done that at our cafe. We've asked people to bring something that makes them smile, and that's fun, and it helps us bring each other into our homes. If you want to delve into the more technical aspects of how different creative activities would be facilitated online, I would refer you to the recording and slides of our June Percolator meeting. We had a panel of teaching artists from 5 different modalities who each describe how they have learned to facilitate virtually. So that's on the Percolator webpage. Of just a few tips: if you're doing sing-alongs, usually you want to mute everyone because the sound travels through each person's broadband, so it's going to be out of sync. But you know, you can also unmute just for the fun of it, but it's not going to sound good. Be wary of showing videos on Zoom because, again, it's a lot of data to have to go through people's broadband, and so it will probably freeze for some of your participants, and that can be frustrating. As I mentioned before, if you have people who are just on the phone, it's good to narrate a little bit what's going on. There are tricks that can help with auditory quality. So if you're using Zoom, there's a setting called original sound if you're playing live music. And then there's a setting called computer audio if you're playing recorded music. So just wanted to mention that those settings are out there, and you can go to the Zoom website and learn how to use them. I wanted to just take you through the agenda of my virtual cafe just to illustrate what it looks like when all this comes together at an actual program. So I do my cafe once a month. It's the same schedule that I had before COVID. It's from 10 to noon. And so I sign on at about 9:45 in the morning. I usually have a guest facilitator, so I make that person a co-host. Guests begin to arrive. At 10, I officially kick things off. And the first thing I do is review the Zoom controls. And I'm going to show you in a minute the slides that I use to orient people to Zoom. I ask participants to type their name in the chat box. That helps me have a better attendance list because it's sometimes really hard to tell who's on depending on what they use as their screen name. Or if there are people on the telephone only, you know, obviously they can't use the chat box, but at least this gives me one more list to draw on. And it also helps them find the chat box and also say hello to each other. So I like starting that way. Then I do some announcements. Our guest artist leads an interactive program. And then we spend the last half hour with our student volunteers having a discussion based on one of Timeslip's beautiful questions. This has worked really well. Every month I ask the volunteers to go into that database, choose a beautiful question, and then they facilitate the discussion. So really quickly, I'm going to just show you the slides that I show my guests at the beginning of the cafe, just to give you some ideas. And then I will be ready to hand the floor over to our next person. So I do share a little bit of information about privacy. This is also in a packet that I send out to people by email, but I just kind of let them know they can be seen and heard during the cafe. I ask people to please join from a private location. If I'm going to record it, I let them know that. and that they can turn off their video if they prefer. So then I show them how to turn off and on their video, and same with audio, how to turn off and on their microphone. And then I show them how to use chat, and at that point I ask them to put their names in the chat box. I have thought about using breakout rooms for the discussion at the end, and I have just felt like it's a bridge too far. So we haven't done that. We've stayed in the larger group. So lastly, just to show you some resources available for you. I've mentioned the Percolator web page. So at the bottom, we have an archive of our meetings ever since we began recording them. Our first several years, we didn't record them, but since last June, we have. And the red circle there is showing you our last 4 meetings have been focused on COVID and the transition to virtual cafes. So there's actually quite a lot of information there. You will also find the link to our Memory Cafe toolkit in both Spanish and English. We also have a 1-minute PSA video about cafes in Spanish and English. That one might not be as useful right now because it's showing cafes that meet in person, but the toolkit should still, I think, be very relevant even if you're running a virtual cafe. And Wisconsin also has a wonderful best practice guide, which is the one you see in the middle there, for memory cafes by Susan McFadden. Highly recommend that. And on the Percolator webpage, there's also a lot of other resources. There's a video in Spanish on how to create a Spanish-speaking cafe. There's a video about cafes designed to be inclusive for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, how to create a memory cafe network, a TED Talk, and so on. National or regional or individual cafe web pages can give you a lot of ideas. And at the bottom there, you see there's a book written by Dr. Luckvig, who I had mentioned earlier, The Alzheimer's and Memory Cafe, How to Start and Succeed with Your Own Cafe. Great resource. Lastly, there is a national cafe directory at memorycafedirectory.com run by Dave Weiderick, and he created a subset there called Cafe Connect. So this is a virtual cafe directory, and it includes not only cafes from all over the US, but some in other countries. And so people can attend these from anywhere. So this is a great place for you to refer folks looking for a cafe. I run a directory for Massachusetts cafes only, which you can just take a look at if you're interested. So please feel free to contact me at any point if anything that I've shared raised questions for you and you'd like to explore it more. Don't hesitate to get in touch with me.